With over 300 combat aircraft, Japan's Air Force is in the top 10 of the world's biggest air forces. On paper, it's got some of the most capable fighter jet types, like the F-15 and the F-35. But how capable is it really? This video will look beyond the mere numbers and analyze what each component of Japan's Air Force brings to the table. It will cover fighter jets and special mission planes, take a detailed look at the capabilities of each plane type and what weapons they use. The video will also take a look at possible threats to Japan and do a comparison with the neighboring air forces, both in numbers and capability level. Finally, we will take a look at the bases and what the future holds for the Japanese Air Force. Japan is arming itself as competition between Japan and China intensifies. That's not always clearly reported by all news sources. Today's sponsor, Ground News, helps cut through the media noise. Ground News aggregates news from various sources worldwide, allowing me to compare perspectives and track how different media outlets shape the narrative. It saves me time and I can use it on my phone or desktop. Take this story on China working on nuclear propulsion for a new aircraft carrier. Over 60 sources covered it, but the coverage varied. Left-leaning sources covered it a bit more often. For example, CBS News framed it as China powering the next generation of aircraft carriers. Meanwhile, on the right, the Daily Express called it a bombshell, with the headline, "Bombshell Satellite Images Show China Building Nuclear Aircraft Carrier." Ground News's features are incredibly useful. I can even see that 80% of the sources reporting on this story have a high factuality rating, meaning I know I can trust the information. Factuality is tracked by 3 independent organizations. Plus, I can check who owns each source, since ownership often comes with its own bias. Another great feature is the blind spot feed. It highlights stories that get lopsided coverage, when one side of the political spectrum largely ignores a topic. For example, left-leaning media often omitted coverage of Hamas claiming that Trump wants to occupy Gaza. Ground News's blind spot feed ensures you don't miss such perspectives. Best of all, here's a special offer for my viewers. Ground News is giving you 40% off their Vantage plan, which I use to access all the app's advanced features. Already subscribed, you can gift Ground News to someone else for 40% off. To get the deal, use my link in the video description. Go to ground.news/Binkov or scan the QR code on the screen. With Ground News, it's easy to stay informed. Try it out. Let's preface this video by saying we will not talk much about SAM systems, even though organization-wise Japan's Air Force does use SAM systems, and SAMs are quite integral to the defense of Japan. Japan is the second biggest Patriot SAM user after the US. These images are straight from the Japanese Ministry of Defense. This one shows big and capable fixed radar sites all across Japan. Of course, in addition to these, Japan relies on many mobile radar systems, usually in the army, and dozens more radars on Navy's ships. Anyway, let's mention the official name of the Japanese Air Force is Japan Air Self-Defense Force. That's more than just a name, as Japan's military was, for decades after World War II, partially shackled by politics. Even though changes were made since, the Air Force today still visibly suffers from the self-defense-only orientation of the yesteryear. But with the new Cold War looming, that's changing. So how many fighter jets does Japan have? Its 3 main types are the F-15, the F-35, and a domestic design, the F-2, though that one too is essentially a reworked, slightly enlarged F-16. Currently, F-15s serve in 7 frontline squadrons. Each one has F-15 CJs, single-seaters, but also a few F-15s DJs, twin-seaters to help with pilot conversion. F-15s also serve in some additional training, aggressor and development units. The J denotes it's a special Japanese variant, not just produced locally, but also featuring some Japanese avionics. It entered service in 1981. Oldest F-15s are on course to reach their projected airframe lifespan of 8,000 hours sometime in 2025. That's just as well, as it's likely the type will indeed see F-35s start replacing them soon. All replacement is gradual, of course. First F-35As were delivered in 2018. but they initially replaced the leftover F-4 fighter jets. There are currently 2 F-35 squadrons active. The third one is to start forming this year and reportedly will form with the F-35B. That's the short takeoff and vertical landing variant. Indeed, it seems the said unit will be new to the Air Force. For some years now, Japan's Air Force has had 12 fighter squadrons, but the announced plans call for 13 fighter squadrons soon. In all likelihood, the specialized F-35B unit will be that additional unit, to be focused on operating from Japan's aircraft carrier ships. In a way, it will be a similar arrangement to what the UK's Royal Navy has. It lost its own fighter jets, but is now operating F-35Bs, which are technically Royal Air Force's planes. The first B models are to arrive in Japan sometime this year. No official recent count exists of the A model inventory, but there should currently be 45 to 50 A models in Japan. Lastly, there are the F-2s. Those started service in the year 2000, with the last delivered in 2011. It's a little unclear as to how many are in service, but when we subtract the prototypes and airframes lost in accidents, there should be around 87 in service. Before F-35s came, those F-2s were the only multi-role fighter jets Japan had. But even so, their multi-role capabilities still leave a lot to be desired. Their main role is still one of anti-shipping, using ASM-2 anti-shipping missiles. Harpoon-class missile, though more modern, relying on 1990s technology and updated in the 2000s to include GPS guidance as well. Curiously, the supersonic ASM-3 has not yet entered service to replace it. Apparently, a better version of it is in the works, to come into service sometime in the near future. The F-2 was the sole JDAM user before F-35 came along. JDAMs are kits that turn dumb bombs into guided ones. Even so, it's questionable just how many JDAMs Japan possesses. By 2018, its inventory was still quite minuscule. Another guidance kit for bombs is the domestic GCS-1, an old weapon from the late Cold War, using infrared signatures to lock onto, devised to be used against high-contrast targets such as ships. The F-2 can use sniper targeting pods, and Japan has procured an undisclosed number of said pods. But in reality, the F-2 is mostly about anti-shipping and air-to-air combat. It has a decentish radar, and the modern air-to-air missiles it carries are the same ones the F-15 uses. Shorter-range missile is the AAM-5. It entered service in 2004 and saw one big update since. It's your average modern imaging infrared seeker missile, roughly comparable to Sidewinder X, Iris-T, PL-10 and so on, probably very deadly at distances of a dozen or 2 miles, used by the F-15 and F-2. The longer-range missile is the AAM-4. It entered service in 1999 and is generally similar to AMRAAM, only with a Sparrow-sized body. Interestingly, a variant entering service around 2011 got a whole new radar seeker, this time using an AESA array. It was the first missile with such a radar. Overall, the missile is probably among the world's best, though of course precise info is confidential. It can't be carried by the F-35 though, so it's limited to F-2 and F-15. Japan also ordered several hundred AMRAAMs over the years, for the F-35 but also for the F-15s. The thing is, when the Cold War ended, Japan's military largely started coasting. Their F-15 fleet is only partially upgraded. Out of the total 200 planes, roughly half are really old models which have not received major modifications. So much so that they have to rely on Cold War-era Sparrow air-to-air missiles. Those are the planes that will soon start getting replaced by the F-35s. The other half of the fleet started off with more modern and programmable avionics, being produced in the late 1980s and 1990s. Due to the sluggishness of the politics, Japan did not start further large modernization until the mid-2000s. Even then, the last modernized plane was delivered only in 2019. Colloquially, those models are labeled as F-15J Kai. Said planes could finally fire Japanese missiles as well. And now, as the previous modernization is already more than 20-year-old tech, contracts were signed for another F-15 fleet modernization, and a quick one this time, with all planes to be delivered modernized by 2030. Roughly speaking, Japanese F-15s will get systems similar to the US EX model, like the radar and the EPAS protection system. Also, for the first time, the F-15s will get more than just dumb bombs to use in air-to-ground fight. They will be cruise missile carriers, as Japan is buying JASSM cruise missiles. LRASM anti-ship missile was also planned at one point, but it seems that was put on a back burner. It could be that domestic anti-ship missiles will be integrated. Overall, the current Japanese combat fleet is fairly potent. The 45-something F-35s are top-of-the-line aircraft. They have stealth, advanced electronics and weapons, at least when it comes to air-to-air. Japan simply doesn't have a varied roster of air-to-ground weapons. The roughly 100-plane-strong F-15 Kai fleet is potent enough. Its electronics are not very competitive, but it's a large plane with massive range, capable of delivering lots of advanced missiles into the fight. The F-2 fleet, just shy of 90 planes, is the multi-role workhorse, perhaps limited by its range and payload, though more modern in general than the F-15. Finally, the remaining 100 largely unmodernized F-15s are of questionable utility. In a modern war, they would be largely ineffective, so it's no wonder they are going away soon. But an air force is not just combat planes. So let us look at special mission aircraft as well. Japan has one of the biggest AWACS-type plane fleets in the world. Its newest models are the E-2D Hawkeyes, which are gradually replacing the old Cold War-era C models. The D has a modern and potent radar, though due to its small size, the plane is not nearly as good at command and control as a larger plane would be. That's why Japan also has 4 E-767s, since the year 2000. Those basically use late model E-3's radar and systems, but mated to the larger Boeing 767 platform. Today, AWACS still play an important role in combat, as they can track various targets hundreds of miles away all around them. Specifically for Japan, the ship tracking mission is also important, which E-2D is also optimized for, as it's used for the same role by the US Navy as well. Electronic signal gathering and processing planes providing signals intelligence are also crucial. Japan is slowly converting the fleet to the new model based on the C-2 transport plane. There is also the electric warfare fleet, meaning planes jamming enemy communications and radars. EC-1 is a unique plane with only one mate, but the jamming fleet is old and it is possible that the RC-2 can in fact also serve as a jammer and may eventually replace the entire jammer fleet. To help with recon and surveillance with so much sea around Japan's islands, 3 Global Hawk drones are also used. Those use radars and optical sensors to monitor the surface from hundreds of miles away, more efficiently than other planes as they are not crewed. And they can fly at 50 to 65,000 feet for 30 hours, or stay airborne for 34 hours, sticking to 50 or so thousand feet. Japan used to have a dedicated recon fleet of F-4s, but those were retired. At one point, dedicated recon F-15s were developed, but that too didn't get anywhere. Today, when recon close to threat areas is needed, Japan relies on small recon drones launched from its F-15s. Tanker planes are also present, of course. 4 Boeing 767 tankers are not that old, with the first arriving in 2005. And now with additional Pegasus tankers, it's obvious Japan is seriously doubling down on long-range missions. Japan isn't big on transport planes, but does have a small fleet made up mostly of domestic designs. We can't list all the other planes and multiple trainer types, but let's mention the T-4, their advanced jet trainer, also a domestic design. Some 190 or so are used to train fighter pilots. All those planes of Japan's Air Force are there to try and address various neighboring threats. In the north, Russia is very close, with Russian Sakhalin and Iturup Islands just dozens of miles away. Japan has a long-standing territorial dispute with Japan over the Kuril Islands. Vladivostok is just 400 miles to the west of Sapporo. Basically, the north of Japan can be approached from 3 out of 4 quadrants. While Russia is currently preoccupied and not a direct threat, its air force is visibly bigger than Japan's, even when adjusted for recent losses. Moving southwards, we will ignore the obsolete air forces of North Korea and go straight to South Korea, with whom Japan does have territorial disputes and some historical antagonism going on. The two mainlands are barely over 100 miles apart. Of course, the most likely opponent might be China. There is really no contest there. Chinese forces are much more potent, but the distance is greater, providing some protection, at least to the mainland, if not to South Ryukyu Islands. And of course, it's not like the US military would just sit still either. Japan has some 25 major air bases and facilities, though naturally only some are configured to house fighter jets. Their locations haven't changed much over the decades, since the times when the Soviet Union, not China, was the main threat, and there are vast differences between bases as well. Misawa, for example, is a huge base where both US and Japanese planes operate from. It has many hardened shelters, while Hyakuri, for example, operates just one fighter jet squadron and features almost no hardened shelters. On average though, Japan's bases are co-located with commercial airports, usually sharing 2 runways and a full taxiway or 2. And they usually do have some shelters for at least part of a squadron, as well as hardened munition storage. In case of an enemy threat, many other commercial airports would surely be used to disperse the air force around if needed. Access to civilian facilities was forbidden by law, until that was changed in 2024. Japan will keep modernizing in the future. It's still got many F-35s left to be delivered. 105 F-35As have been budgeted and planned so far, which means another 60 or so are in store. On top of those, all 42 F-35Bs are yet to be delivered starting this year. That's all probably gonna take until 2030 or so to get delivered. As said, the F-35s are to replace the 100 oldest unmodernized F-15s. But the biggest future star is gonna be the gcap fighter, next-generation fighter jet co-developed with Britain and Italy. The prototype is still yet to fly, so that's all some years away. Right now, the hope is to have the prototype fly by 2030 and to get first mass production planes by 2035. That would suggest service entry around 2037 or so. We'll see. Binkov already did a lengthy piece on gcap a year and a half ago, so we won't repeat ourselves much. But it's gonna be a very large fighter, capable of carrying many outsized weapons, and naturally there will be some unmanned wingman drones involved as well. But no real details about those exist yet. Initial fleet requirements are for gcap to replace the F-2 fleet in Japan. That's maybe 90 or so planes required, but it's just as plausible that given the stretched out timelines we mentioned, gcap will also eventually replace the remaining 100 F-15s, perhaps in combination with some additional F-35s. That's all in the 2040s, so who knows what will really happen by then. There are some novel weapons to be added as well. gcap was supposed to get a whole new long-range air-to-air missile called JNAAM. That program has now been shelved, at least for the time being, though it's very likely that once gcap is in the air, there will be some new missile variants flying around as well. But there are other missiles that are also likely to be procured. Joint Strike Missile, cruise and anti-ship missile that can fit inside F-35 will keep getting procured. Work is being done on an improved Type 12 missile. That name is an obfuscation. Type 12 has very little in common with this new missile, which is larger and stealthier. Japan plans to invest $36 billion in long-range strike capability over the years, so part of that will find its way to the Air Force. One program is similar to the US Rapid Dragon, where cruise missiles will be dispensed by transport planes. In Japan's case, possibly their C-2 transport planes. Their fleet is planned to rise by 6 more airframes in the future, getting to 22 in total. The missile used by those transports was not disclosed, but it's likely to be the US JASM, just like with the Rapid Dragon. Japan is also working on hypersonic weapons, one of which is supposed to be an air-launched, air-breathing missile. It's important to stress that hypersonics take a lot of effort and time to develop, and Japan doesn't have that much experience, so this might be a pie-in-the-sky kind of project. Japan does have the industrial base and money, so we'll see. 2 more Pegasus tanker planes are planned, taking the final total to 6, further expanding the tanker fleet and signaling the need for Japan's Air Force to keep widening its operational footprint. Finally, the T-4 jet trainer is now over 35 years old and will need replacement. Said effort has started, though so far there is no mention of a domestic design. On the contrary, only the US T-7 advanced trainer has been mentioned. It would be a logical choice, which might bring a lot more capability to the table, as that's a larger jet with room for some token avionics and weaponry. In the end, the Japanese Air Force is evidently evolving. Today, it's still partially stuck in the past, too much oriented towards just defensive missions, and in parts curiously stuck with a semi-obsolete fleet. It will be able to dish out some cruise missiles, but regular bomb strikes on the ground is something the Air Force is not even striving for. I guess the US is there for that. The main role of Japan's Air Force may be to simply blunt China's initial edge and slow China down, before significant US reinforcements can arrive. It's not meant to try and liberate Taiwan, for example. But money is pouring in, and in a decade or two it may reach its full potential. Given the geopolitical realities, it remains to be seen whether that's gonna be too little, too late. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.